I trust that everyone had a very happy Purim yesterday. And today, of course, is Shushan Purim.
Did if you move it a little bit. Sorry. Okay.
So, I thought we would savor the aftertaste of Purim and discuss some of the follow-up. If you listen carefully to the Megillah, so you know that the 10th chapter, the final chapter of the Megillah, is very short. It's comprised of 3 verses, which really have nothing to do with the Purim story. It's really the aftermath of the Purim story. And it says, Vayosem hamelech Achashverosh mas al haaretz v'yeh hayom. The king Achashverosh placed a tax on the land and the islands of the sea. So he imposed a tax. Why is this important for us to know? Who cares? It's interesting to note that there is one other place in the Megillah where taxes are discussed. When Esther became queen, it says that Achashverosh lowered taxes. He made a reduction in taxes for all the countries. And it seems there's a symmetry. Earlier in the story he reduces the taxes, and now he raises the taxes. But why is this important for us to know? And it continues, V'chol ma'asei sakpo gvuraso, and all his mighty deeds, u'forashas gdulas Mordechai shegid lo hamelach, and a full account of the greatness of Mordechai, who the king promoted, halohem ksuvim al sefer divrei hayomim l'malchei modei u'foras. They are inscribed in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Modai and Paras. So the author of the Megillah is saying that if you want more information, refer to that work. This was a volume, perhaps it was published, perhaps it was not published, called the Divrei Hayom, the Chronicles of the Kings of Modai and Paras. If you want a full account of the mighty deeds of Achashverosh and a full account of the greatness of Mordechai, it's there. Ki Mordechai HaYehudi Mishna L'Melech Achashverosh. For Mordechai the Jew was the viceroy to Achashverosh, the Gadol HaYehudim, and a great man among the Jews. V'ratzui l'rov echad. He found favor among the majority of his brethren. Doresh tov la'amo. He sought the good of his people. V'dover shalom l'chol zaro. And he was concerned for the welfare of their posterity, meaning the future generations that would be born to his contemporaries. The commentaries point out that the key, that first word in the 3rd verse, doesn't make any sense. Key normally introduces a reason. We do X, or X was done, key, because of this. How does it follow in this verse? That the account of Mordechai's greatness is written in that book because Mordechai Yehudi was the viceroy and he was good for the Jews. So his being good for the Jews, that explains why this is written in the Chronicles of the Persian kings. It's a non sequitur, it doesn't follow. Now Chazal talk about this verse and they focus on one little aspect of it, and maybe from that we can broaden the understanding of the chapter, perhaps understand a little bit some of the earlier episodes, and perhaps derive a valuable lesson for ourselves. It says that he was great among the Jewish people. V'ratzui l'rov echav. He found favor with the majority of his brothers. What about the minority? Who was against him? So Chazal say that there was a faction within the Sanhedrin, within the Supreme Court, the highest body of Jewish scholars, that disagreed with Mordechai. And how did Chazal know this is a reference to the Sanhedrin? Well, you think about it for a second. It says that he was Gadol HaYehudim. He was great among the Jews. He was Ratzui l'Rov Echav. He found favor to the majority of his brothers. Who are his brothers? Who are the Jews and who are his brothers? So the Jews are the Jews. The brothers must imply a closer relationship. His colleagues, not just his fellow co-religionists, his brethren. Now we know, according to Chazal, Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a member of that Supreme Court. So probably Echav refers to his fellow Torah scholars. Yes?
Did the Sanhedrin sit in exile as well?
No, he was a member because he lived in Eretz Yisrael.
Oh,
He was temporarily in exile, but he was a member of that court. So he was Gadol HaYehudim, meaning among the masses, he was regarded as a great man. They were on his side. But among his brethren, among those people who, I would guess to Mordechai, their opinion really counted, there was a solid majority behind him, but there was a miut, there was a minority that did not agree with his decisions. Why? What was the issue? It was because of his becoming entangled with the government. And Rashi says that that led to the neglect of his own Torah studies. So this faction held that was a mistaken arrangement of priorities. It was rather than entangling himself in the affairs of government, he should have disengaged, gone back to the Beis Medrash, opened his Gemara, and start learning. So his becoming involved and rising to a position of power in the government, this was something that a minority didn't approve of. The majority held it was justified. The miut held it was unjustified. So what is the question? What is the issue over here? Obviously we're dealing with something that is not a black and white issue. It was a judgment call. Mordechai had a majority behind him, but there was a faction that was not behind him, and that faction was significant enough that their opinion was recorded, at least hinted to, by saying that he was Ratzui l'Rov Echav, that he was approved of by the majority. The pasuk clearly is coming to tell me that the minority disapproved. So what made the issue be?
It's Rashi who says what the issue is?
Rashi says that's why the minority disapproved.
That the issue is that he didn't leave government.
Right. Now the question, what's the shaila? So let's talk a little bit about our attitudes towards the government of the day. Because when we live in Golus, and we live in a country, so should Jews be involved in the government? Should they not be involved with the government? There's a verse in the book of Yirmiyah. Yirmiyah is telling the Jews about the Golus Bavel to come. And Yirmiyah, if you study the book of Yirmiyah, we know that Yirmiyah waged a war against the false prophets. The false prophets would tell the Jews all sorts of things. And Yirmiyah had to correct them. One of the things the false prophet said was that the Babylonian exile will be very short. In a very short time, the Jews will be liberated and be allowed to return to Eretz Yisrael. And Yirmiyah goes out of his way to tell them that it's not that way. You're going to be there for a long time. And he says you should build houses and plant gardens and marry and have children and settle. Because it's going to be a long time. It's going to be 70 years. And among the things he says is this: V'dirshu eshloim ha'ir asher higleisi eschem shoma, and seek the welfare of the city to which I exile you. V'isparlu va'ado el Hashem, and pray for it to God. Ki v'shloma, for in its peace, yeh lechem shalom, will be for you peace. In other words, your fate is bound with the fate of the city in which you're exiled. So the Navi says two things. First, seek its welfare, and secondly, pray for it. Now, we're all familiar with this idea of praying for the country in which you live, because it's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah says, "Hevi mispal b'shleim shel malchus." A person should pray for the welfare of the government, because if not for the fear of government, ishis re'eu chayim below, people would swallow each other up alive. And you may be familiar with the thought of Thomas Hobbes, who said this, who said that the purpose of government is because without government, human beings would descend into anarchy. Everyone would be in a state of war against every other one. And everyone would be at risk of losing life and property. And therefore we have to have a government, and there has to be a fear of government, and that keeps people in line. And that's exactly what Chazal said hundreds of years before. That pray for the welfare of the government, because if not for the fear of the law, the fear of authority, people would swallow each other up alive. But going back to the pasuk in Yirmiyah is really saying more than that. He says, seek the welfare of the city and pray for it. Assuming that it isn't a redundancy, he must be telling us something else besides praying for it. Seek the welfare of the city. What does it mean to seek the welfare of the city? It means to become involved in the life and affairs of the community. Perform public service, vote, support the political leaders, maybe run for office as well. Involve yourself in the welfare of the community. And of course you have to pray too. You never neglect prayer. Prayer is a very important thing. But if the city is tranquil and at peace, that'll be good for the Jews. Now, this is true in two different senses. In one sense, it's true because the welfare of any member of the community is related to the welfare of the community as a whole. You speak about the economy of the community. If it's a larger pie, then my share of the pie is larger. If it's a smaller pie, then my share of the pie is smaller. So therefore, it's a very good thing that the economy should be well developed and booming, because everyone benefits, including the Jews. But there's also something which is uniquely Jewish. When things go bad, who are the first people to be blamed? The Jews. Why the Jews? Because the Jews are the quintessential outsiders. And we always want to blame the outsiders. We never want to point fingers at ourselves. So when things aren't as they should be, it's the foreign influence, the foreign money, the foreign control, the foreign interest, and so on and so forth. And Jews are by definition foreigners. It's unavoidable. We have our own law, our own Torah, our own way, distinctive modes of dress, language, religion, etc. So when we are in Golus, it isn't just that we prosper when the nation is prosperous. When the nation fails, we are in danger, because we are the scapegoats. We are always to blame for the problems that be. So therefore, we have a vested interest in promoting the welfare of the country in which we live, because otherwise, we will be the victims. We will be to blame for anything that fails and goes wrong. That's what Yirmiyah seems to be saying. And that seems to be Mordechai's position. Because Mordechai understands that if circumstances put him in the position where he could perform service to Achashverosh and rise to power, this is something which is good for the Jews. Because by strengthening the government, the Jews' position is strengthened. But there's one very important difference between what Yirmiyah is talking about and what the Megillah is talking about. Yirmiyah was talking about the beginning of the Golus Babel, when there was a Gzeira Shamayim, there was a decree from heaven that the Jews were going to be banished to Babel for 70 years. The Jews were forced to be in Babel. They could not return to Eretz Yisrael. So Yirmiyah says, make the most of your plight. If you're going to be here anyway, build houses and settle, marry, raise families. And of course, in that situation, if you're condemned to be here, then you should also seek the welfare of the government. Here in Persia, we have an unusual situation. The Jews were already given a license to return to Eretz Yisrael by the predecessor of Achashverosh, Koresh. And the response to this call was very, very meager. Only 40,000 returned. 40,000 out of hundreds of thousands. Now, why might that be? Well, keep in mind that over 70 years, a new generation replaces the old generation. So we're talking about people who were born in Bavel, people who were born in exile, who don't have that same sense of Eretz Yisrael being my home from which I was exiled. But these are people that knew nothing else but Bavel.
In most cases, their fathers would have been born in Bavel.
It could be over 70 years. It could be like that. It could be these are the grandchildren of people that were exiled. So they identified home as Bavel. So when Persia overthrew Babylonia and Persia gave this license for Jews to go back to Eretz Yisrael, how many Jews had these strong feelings? Now, the Pella, the wonder is, why did the 40,000 return? Well, you have to say those 40,000 undoubtedly were raised in families where there was a strong Zionist education. So they were inspired and they believed it. But the masses, that wasn't the case. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. I think we're dealing with a similar situation here. Whereas our situation here is that we have all the freedom in the world. Anybody who would want to move to Eretz Yisrael can move. And yet, who's moving? Not so fast. Not so fast. So we're really dealing with a very similar situation. That's how we can understand it. In that situation, what should we be doing? Should we be strengthening our position here? Should we be making our North American galus more comfortable? Or should we really be thinking of returning to Eretz Yisrael to the extent that, to the contrary, why should we invest effort in making the United States an attractive place for people to stay? Now, whenever we talk about something which is relevant to ourselves, our judgment is always clouded. So let me talk about a related question on which we will have objectivity. Over the last number of years, there's a tremendous effort, a tremendous investment made to create Jewish infrastructure in Europe. In places like Germany and Hungary, Austria, and so on and so forth.
Former Soviet Union.
Former Soviet Union. Now, is that a good thing?
No.
Or is that a bad thing? Well, we have one opinion here in the audience. No, this is a good question. The question is that we know that when things are bad for Jews in these countries, that creates a certain pressure to emigrate, and generally the most open door is Israel. And we know that when the Soviet Union opened its doors, there was a tremendous, tremendous emigration to Israel. If the Jewish infrastructure would have been provided then in the Soviet Union, the result may have been that many Jews would remain behind. Is that something that we should be doing, or is that something we shouldn't be doing? Well, it's a good question. Now the reality is this. It's the same question. In other words, it's the same question. Should we be building our community in Canada? Or should we allow it to become so wretched that we would be forced to run to Eretz Yisrael? Or not? It's just that in Canada, since we're here, so we are not very objective. When we discuss Eastern Europe, we can be more objective. It's like the joke.
There's a difference.
A huge difference.
Yeah.
Because in one case, you have a conscious funding of another place. For instance, you could fund old people's home because it's maybe old people don't want to travel. But should you put the same amount of money into, day schools and things like that, where you want to encourage younger families to move? It's harder to get an older family to it, perhaps.
Okay, so this is the question. But we're funding...
Here it's self-generated by the people that are here.
Well, I don't know about that. I think there are many communities where the funds are raised from out of town. It's a general question. But we talk about objectivity. It reminds me of the joke. There once was in Russia, communist Russia, there was a commissar who was drilling the young boys in socialist ideology. And he says to them, if you had 2 cars, what would you do? And the boy answers, 1 for myself and 1 for my comrades. Very good. If you had 2 planes, what would you do? 1 for myself, 1 for my comrades. Very good. If you had 2 boats, what would you do? 1 for myself, 1 for my comrades. Very good. If you had 2 coats, what would you do? So the boy's quiet. He says, boy, if you had 2 coats, what would you do? He's quiet. Why don't you answer? He says, I have 2 coats. It's... When it becomes personal, it's very hard to make these judgments. But it would seem that this really is the issue. In other words, the miyut, that smaller body of the Sanhedrin, said like this, that what is the point of ingratiating ourselves to Achashverosh, to Persia, to acquiring power? For what? So that we can have a comfortable existence in Persia? Let it be an uncomfortable existence in Persia, and this will compel more people to emigrate to Eretz Yisrael. That's a reasonable position. It was outvoted. The Rav, the majority of this had held that Mordechai was right. But this debate is still a debate.
It's curious because Mordechai, it's not like Mordechai became involved in government after the death of Haman. He was involved in government from the beginning of the story. He had access to the throne.
It's different. It's different. He was one of the people that was Yoshev B'Shar HaMelech, because he was there to deal with Jewish issues, crises, etc. But now he's not there to deal with Jewish issues. He is providing service for the kingdom as a whole. He's a Mishnah Lamelech. He is the viceroy. He's not the representative to the Jewish community. He is fully involved in the life of Persia. That is something new.
So he was perceived as like the minister of Jewish affairs at that time.
Then he was the core Jew. Right? But now he is the Mishnah Lamelech. He is the viceroy. Right? His role is not a Jewish role at all. His role is a Persian role. Now, the truth is this. The truth is that this is really the significance of the tax. You see, Achashverosh really was a very, very weak king. If you look at the story, and you read between the lines and look at the hints in Chazal, he was a weak king temperamentally. Now, the Gemara says he was a hafach fechon. He bounced back and forth. He was indecisive. He waffled. One of my kids received a shalach manos yesterday from his Rebbe, which contained a yo-yo. And the Rebbe explained that the symbolism of the yo-yo is because Achashverosh was a yo-yo. Because if you're indecisive, you're up, you're down, you're here, you're there. He was a malach hafach fechon. And we can understand why. The Gemara says that really he was not of royal stock. When his predecessor, Daryavesh and Koresh, when they died, there was a vacuum of leadership, and Achashverosh had spread his money wisely and bought the throne. But this was not something which was solidly his, and he felt he had to gain the approval of the Sarim and so on and so forth. So how do you win people over? You win people over by wining and dining them. So he made a massive party, 180 days. And this was for all the officers, all the generals, all the dignitaries of the regime. And he entertained them, gave them bread and circuses, and won them over, won their loyalty. In the process, he may have bankrupted the regime. You know, it's not an easy thing to provide that lavish entertainment. But it seems he was weak. And it says in the Megillah that Achashverosh never made a decision without consulting everybody. That when Vashti didn't come, so he summoned Hakarov Elov, he summoned the 7 closest advisors, Kichein Dvar HaMelech, for this was the way of the king, Lifnei Yodei Das Vadin. All issues, all important decisions were presented to people that knew the law. Now it's interesting that in that verse it says that when he summoned his wise men, it says they were the Chachamim Yodei Ha'itim, the people who knew times. And the Mefarshim say, Al Derech HaPshat, it means that not always is the law meant to be applied. You have to know how it's going to fly. You have to know the times in which you live, how it will be perceived. And Achashverosh was very sensitive to that. By the end of the Megillah, Achashverosh is a strong king. He is going to tax the people heavily. Now, whether that is the best policy or not the best policy, I'll leave that up to economists. The supply side, etc. I can't tell you whether it's the best policy, but it's a policy. It's a policy. In the United States, these issues are being debated now. What would a ideal policy be? To cut spending or to raise taxes? But the government, the administration, would like to have it both ways. Let's spend money and not raise taxes. So the deficit is ballooning, the accumulated debt is ballooning. Now the country will be bankrupted, but in the meantime they're kicking the can down the road. It'll be dealt with by some later administration. But it's frightful. It's frightful. But Achashverosh is making a decision now. Okay, his decision wasn't to cut services. His decision was to raise taxes. But the point is, he's decisive. He's strong. What changed? What changed is he has Mordechai. Now Mordechai is the Mishnah Melech. Mordechai advises him. Mordechai guides him. I don't know if anybody likes paying taxes, but it was a decision that shows strength on the part of the king. And that's the influence of Mordechai. And that's why Mordechai is recorded in the Divrei Hayamim Malchei Madei Ufaras, in the book of Chronicles of the Persian kings. Mordechai is placed there. He wasn't a Persian king, but he was a Mishnah Melech. But the question is something else. Then why did Mordechai allow himself to be written? Who writes history? Nowadays, history is written by outsiders, journalists, professional historians. But in the olden days, history was written under the watchful eye of the kings themselves. And that's why historical accounts in the ancient world are notoriously unreliable.
Does that include the Megillah?
Pardon?
Does that include the Megillah?
No. The Megillah is in Ruach HaKodesh, right? But historical accounts, the Divrei Hayamim Malchei Madei Ufaras probably was written in such a way that made the kings look good in any case. So why would Mordechai want his involvement to be recorded? Why didn't he want to remain behind the scenes? It was important to Mordechai that everyone should understand why he was doing what he did. And therefore, it was written there that everyone should know that his efforts were because he was Gadol HaYehudim. He was seeking the welfare of his people. So he wanted that there should be a complete and accurate record of this. And that's, I think, the Hemshech. That's the continuation of the Psukim. Then why are these things recorded there? Because Mordechai, he was the Mishnah Melech, but he was first and foremost concerned with Jewish welfare. He wanted there should be a record of what he had done. If you look through the Megillah, there are all sorts of hints to this idea. This was Mordechai's strategy. For example, when it was revealed to Mordechai a plot to assassinate Achashverosh, Bigsim and Seresh, so Achashverosh is informed of this plot by Esther in the name of Mordechai. Now the question is this: why did Mordechai reveal this plot? Let's think about this from Mordechai's perspective. Esther, according to Chazal, was Mordechai's wife. She was taken to the palace. The death of Achashverosh could perhaps bring about Esther's release. Certainly it wouldn't hurt. So if Bigsim and Seresh are willing to assassinate Achashverosh, no one knows that Mordechai knows. There'll be no accusation of disloyalty because Mordechai didn't reveal the plot. No one knew that Mordechai knew the plot. So why is Mordechai so interested in saving the life of Achashverosh, even though it worsens his own position? By sparing Achashverosh, Esther is more likely to remain behind in the palace. Now the answer is simply this: that Mordechai understands that when you do a favor for the king, you gain influence. That influence can be evaluated down the road. Therefore, any opportunity that presented itself to do a favor, do a kindness, was worth doing, especially because we know from later in the Megillah, Chazal tell us this, Achashverosh was a grateful person. He acknowledged all favors. That's why he couldn't sleep that night, because he suspected that Haman and Esther were plotting against him. And then he said to himself, why is no one telling me? Perhaps there's someone I didn't reward for some service he provided. And he asked for the chronicles to be brought to see, and it was discovered there was one person that had done him a good turn and he hadn't rewarded. That was Mordechai. So apparently the facts must be that as a rule he did. He was a person willing to acknowledge other people's favors. And on the one occasion that he didn't, he felt he wanted to make amends and pay Mordechai back. So therefore Mordechai understood beforehand that providing this service would allow him to gain influence. In fact, that was the case. But Haman was hanged because he tried to have Mordechai killed. But why was Mordechai the one who took over Haman's place? Because that was Mordechai, as it says in the Megillah, Asher diber tov al hamelech. He spoke well for the king. He is the one that saved the king's life by transmitting the information. There's a very interesting thing, very interesting Gemara. And I think maybe this is perhaps the only understanding of the Gemara. In the book of Tehillim, in Psalm 22, Chazal tell us that this psalm was the prayer of Esther when she went in on the third day to beseech Achashverosh. And there's a verse there that says like this. The verse says, Hatzila mecherev nafshi, save my spirit from the sword, miyad kela v'chidasi, my soul from the dog, hoshi'ein v'pi aryeh, save me from the lion. Now, it seems she was scared of Achashverosh. So first, she refers to Achashverosh as a dog, and then she refers to him as a lion. Now, keeping that in mind, let me tell you what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that when she went in on the third day, it says, Vatilbash Esther Malchus. She was clothed in royalty. So what does that mean? Bigdei Malchus miboyle. The pasuk should say she wore royal garments. It says here she wore royalty. So Melamed, this teaches us Shalofshas Ruach HaKodesh. She was clothed with Ruach HaKodesh. Now what does Ruach HaKodesh mean? It's important to know this. There's a phenomenon called Nevuah. Nevuah means there is communication between God and man. That means that there is some substantive message which is transmitted from the divine intelligence to the Navi. It could be words, it could be an image, but there's some information that's conveyed. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim says, Ruach HaKodesh is one notch below actual Nevuah. Ruach HaKodesh is not a substantive message. There is no information that God conveys to the person who has Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh is a gift of some unique talent or quality which the person can then use for good things, hopefully. So, for example, Shimshon had Ruach HaKodesh. It says in the Pasuk, V'yachal Ruach Hashem lefa'amo, that the Spirit of God began to ring in him. So the Rambam says, what was that Ruach HaKodesh? What was this divine spirit that he had? Was his supernatural strength. And the supernatural strength of Shimshon was a manifestation of Ruach HaKodesh. That means it wasn't the type of strength that a person could naturally attain. Even if he joined a gym, work out, exercise, eat well, he would never have that level of strength. There's an upper limit that the human body can only lift so much, push so much, bear so much, and Shimshon's strength was beyond that. That was Ruach HaKodesh. That's a special gift. It was a supernatural gift of strength. It's not, there was information that was conveyed. It's a talent, it's a skill, it's a power. Shimshon used it, of course, to battle the Plishtim. The books of Tehillim, for example, that were written by David HaMelech, and Mishlei written by Shlomo HaMelech, were written b'Ruach HaKodesh. That means it wasn't that God dictated these books to David and Shlomo, but they were given a gift of eloquence, of understanding, of profound thought, which enabled them to compose these very, very deep, very, very holy works. So that's called Ruach HaKodesh. The Netziv says, for example, an interesting thing. It says that when Sarah and Avram had the debate what to do with Yishmael, to keep him, to send him away, so Sarah said, send him away. Avram held that they should keep him home. So Hashem told Avram that whatever Sarah tells you to do, do. So Gemara says, this teaches us that Avram was secondary to Sarah in Ruach HaKodesh, in this spirit. Sarah was Avram's superior. So the Netziv, in his Perish on Chumash, in the beginning of Parshas Chayei Sarah, asks the question, what does it mean Avram was secondary? God speaks to Avram in the Chumash many, many times. We never find God speaking to Sarah. So the Netziv says, of course, when we talk about Nevuah, which is substantive transmission, of course Avram was greater than Sarah. God spoke to Avram more than he spoke to Sarah. Never spoke to Sarah. Spoke to Avram many times. But we're not talking about Nevuah, we're talking about Ruach HaKodesh. We're talking about the ability to understand a situation and to respond appropriately. In that, Sarah was greater than Avram. And therefore the Malach was giving Avram a rule of thumb. If you ever find yourself in a situation you don't know what to do, and you say X and Sarah says Y, do Y. Because in this aspect of Ruach HaKodesh, this ability to understand a situation and to think of an appropriate response, Sarah was the superior of Avram. Yeah, of course, when it comes to speaking, God spoke to Avram more than he spoke to Sarah. But in terms of the understanding, which is Ruach HaKodesh, Sarah was the superior. So Esther was clothed with Ruach HaKodesh. What is in Ruach HaKodesh? I mean, she's about to embark on a very, very important mission. She's going to have to deal with Achashverosh. She has to plan, scheme, etc., etc., etc. The life and future of the entire Klal Yisrael is dependent on her success in this mission. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave her Ruach HaKodesh. She went into the palace, And at that point, Nistal Kaim Ben Ashchina, the divine presence, the Ruach HaKodesh departed. How did she know? Because she felt at this moment that that gift of insight was all gone. Imagine you're acting in the school play, and you've studied your lines, and you got them down pat, and then you get on stage, and all of a sudden, what do I say? That was the situation she found herself in. Because she was given a gift of Ruach HaKodesh, and that enabled her to plan, what am I going to say, what am I going to do, what if he responds this way, what will my reaction be? She had it all worked out. And then as she approached, it was all gone. No more. No more. So in that psalm, there's a famous verse, the second verse. Keli, Keli, lama zavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? It's a reference to this fact that the Ruach HaKodesh departed. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says that Esther was wondering why. What was the issue? So maybe the issue was this, that one of her plans was to go and seduce Achashverosh. If she would do that, then Achashverosh might be inclined to do whatever she wants. But there was a problem over here, because she was really married to Mordechai. In the past, any time that she consorted with the king, there was an implicit threat of death. When the king calls his queen to the bedroom, so the understanding is that if you don't come, you're going to be put to death. How do we know that? Vashti, right? So we know that when the king calls his wife, she better come. So therefore Esther always had the justification that I'm compelled, I'm being forced. But now she's going to seduce him, now it's baratzai. So maybe that's a sin. But Esther said, here it's also under duress. Because I'm not doing it for myself, for my pleasure, I'm doing it to save the Jewish people. So this is also an oines, this is also compulsion. So Esther said, the Ruach HaKodesh depart, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu equates Shoigeg and Mezid and Oines and Ratzai. Does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say that intention makes no difference? It makes no difference whether the sin is inadvertent, whether it's deliberate, whether it's compelled, whether it's voluntary. It makes no difference. Can't be, that's not fair. In other words, Esther suspected that perhaps the Ruach HaKodesh departed because her plan was to commit a sin of having illicit relations with Achashverosh, and Esther said, that can't be, that's not fair. Or maybe, she said, maybe it's because of the sin that I called him a dog. Because in her prayer she said, Miyad kela l'chidas, he saved my soul from the dog. She referred to Achashverosh as a dog. That's a terrible sin. So therefore she corrected herself and called him a lion. And that's the next verse. That Hoshienu pi aryeh, save him from the mouth of the lion. Now this is a mystery. Right? What's going on? The Ruach HaKodesh departs. This jeopardizes the very success of her mission. She's wondering what could the reason possibly be. Oh, I understand. I did something wrong. I called him a dog. I'm going to correct that and call him a lion. What's the issue? What's the issue? The question really is the same question. How do we look at Achashverosh? Is he a dog? Or can we turn him into a lion? Right? In the end of the story, Mordechai turns him into a lion. Because Mordechai sees that Achashverosh is not a dog. He's not hopeless. Because with support, and encouragement, training, we can make him into a powerful monarch. But this is not how he was thought of beforehand. Right? The Achashverosh was the hafach v'chan, who waffles, who's indecisive, who can't make a decision. All he can do is buy friends and supporters. What is the original Achashverosh? He's a dog. He's a dog. He's low. He's nothing. He's a nobody. This Esther understood now that that was a very serious mistake. It was a very serious mistake. See, she was going in with the attitude that this fellow I'm speaking to is another one of those low people who is easily pushed around, and we just have to extricate ourselves from this mess, and he's a nobody, and Rebbeinu Shalom will knock him down like he knocked down everyone else, and so on and so forth. Then Esther realized, now that's not the point over here. That our salvation is ultimately not going to be by overthrowing Achashverosh. Our salvation is going to be by strengthening Achashverosh. Right? We have to turn him into a lion. So she corrected herself. Instead of calling him a dog, called him a lion, and then the Ruach HaKodesh was restored. You see, because the idea of losing Ruach HaKodesh is like this. If you are given a gift of talent, if you use it properly, you have it. If you don't use it, you lose it. Right? Part of Ruach HaKodesh, part of that ability to understand something is to stop looking at things in the conventional way. Because we all approach an issue with a certain preconceived notion. This is how we think of it, this is how it always is, this is how my parents thought of it, this is how my grandparents thought of it. The ability to see it from a new perspective, to understand that we're in a changed situation, calls for a different response, different understanding. Ruach HaKodesh can facilitate that. But if you're not willing to use the Ruach HaKodesh, if you just look at things using the default setting, then you don't need Ruach HaKodesh. You're not using Ruach HaKodesh. If you call Achashverosh a dog, that shows that you're just thinking in the old way. That you have an enemy of the Jewish people, he's a dog, he needs to be overthrown, and we will be redeemed. This is not the point. The point over here is, he's a lion. The trick is going to be to make him our lion. And we're going to have to turn him to our way of seeing things. He'll be a lion that will represent Jewish interests. And we will do that by reinforcing his regime, strengthening his regime, giving him the fortitude to act through conviction rather than just pandering to the crowd. It's an amazing thing. And therefore, when she changed her words, and instead of calling him a dog, called him a lion, the Ruach HaKodesh came back. Now you're using your head. Now the Ruach HaKodesh is worthwhile. Because you're using your brain. You're thinking through. You understand things are different. And that really is what it's all about. The Megillah, essentially, the resolution of the Megillah is, this is how Jews are meant to survive in Golus. Right? We survive in Golus not by overthrowing the regime under which we live. We survive in Golus by strengthening, by supporting, etc. As we said, this was a controversial position. There was a miut of the Sanhedrin that said, no. If we have the option to go back to Eretz Yisrael, then we should not be working to uphold and strengthen the local regime. To the contrary, you're facilitating our being able to live here successfully. But again, that's only a minority opinion. We can't get carried away by the minority. We follow the majority opinion. And that was the majority opinion. And the truth is that there's another aspect to it, which is the fact that even Eretz Yisrael was part of the Persian Empire. So even if a Jew would choose to move to Eretz Yisrael, which he was allowed to do, it doesn't mean he wasn't under the control of the Persians. Now, this is a question. It is said that all the greatest Zionists live in America. You ever hear that? Never heard that? I think it's a fact. Right? That, all the big Zionists live in America. Why? Because they understand that if not for the United States, Israel would be in Gehaktiv Zaros. Not that the United States is doing too much nowadays. But once upon a time, it certainly was the case, and I think even now, as much as we think that the government could do more, what it is doing is essential. And it only does it because of Jewish influence. So when these people publish articles about the Jewish lobby in Washington and Jewish influence, on the one hand, I say, oh, that's terrible. We shouldn't let them get away with saying things like that. We should convey the impression that everything that the government does for Israel is really to advance American needs and concerns. But the reality probably is true. Right? It's true because Jews give generous campaign donations, and Jews have influence in the halls of power, especially in Congress, and that's a good thing. And that only is possible because there is a significant Jewish population in America. In other words, if the Jewish population in America would shrink significantly, then our influence would be less, and Israel would be more endangered. So I think there's truth to that too. There's truth to the idea that sometimes you could better advance interests in Israel from this end. And I think that's Mordechai's perspective as well. Mordechai said, listen, it's not just for the benefit of people living in Persia. Our efforts to build Achashverosh, to support Achashverosh, are really for the benefits of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael as well. And therefore this is something that has to be promoted, and that's the opinion of the Rav. The Ramban in Chumash says an amazing thing. It says in Parshas B'chukosai, which according to the Ramban is the Teichacha, the litany of curses that was fulfilled with the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. It says, Vizvadu es avaynam v'savon avoysam. The Jews will confess their sin and the sin of their fathers. They'll repent, they'll do tshuva. And it says, what will the consequence be? I will bring them into the land of their enemies. So the commentaries are bothered that makes no sense. If they repented, then God should forgive them, not that God should bring them to the land of their enemies. So the Ramban says an amazing thing. The Ramban says that this verse, the land of your enemies, is a reference to Eretz Yisrael. That when the Jews in Bavel do tshuva, the Jews will return back to Eretz Yisrael, but Eretz Yisrael will be the land of their enemies, because during the time of the Bayis Sheni, it was under foreign dominion. And that means that we can't act as we acted when the Commonwealth was independent. We have to acknowledge that reality, that even Eretz Yisrael is a vassal state. And that means finding favor in the eyes of the powers that be. And that's exactly what Mordechai does. Whereas Mordechai gains influence with Achashverosh in order to strengthen Jewish interests in Persia and in Eretz Yisrael as well. And therefore, Megillas Esther really is a book about survival in Golus. Survival in Golus. And it's very, very interesting that when Achashverosh is weak, that's when he is susceptible to the influence of a Haman. When Achashverosh is strong, that's when the Jews are secure. And that's what Mordechai works for. Yes?
Seems to me that he is susceptible to the advice of his prime minister, regardless of whether his prime minister is a good prime minister or an evil prime minister.
No,
that doesn't make him strong.
No. There's a very big difference. There's a very big difference. You see, Haman is the real power, right? Achashverosh, is willing to do whatever Haman says. He says, whatever you want, do whatever you want.
But,
right?
But Achashverosh has vested power in him. He's promoted during the Megillah.
That's right. Right. In other words, Achashverosh, he's willing to do whatever Haman will tell him. Right.
And not with Mordechai?
That may be, but the point is, but Mordechai understands, right, that what he has to do. See, let me say one thing.
Oh, it's in Mordechai's self-interest to make
in the Megillah, it's
choice.
clear. It's clear that what he's advising Achashverosh to do is a potential embarrassment for the regime. Right? In other words, Haman understands what he's telling Achashverosh to do is not good for the regime. Right? That's clear from Chazal. He says that Achashverosh raised all sorts of objections. He covered over the objections. Right? It's not a good thing that a kingdom should commit genocide against a portion of its own population. Right? Haman manipulates. Right? Mordechai understands that to the contrary, we will accomplish more if we direct Achashverosh, encourage him to act in a manner which is productive for the regime. Right? That's why I think that when Jews run for office and Jews become aides and advisors, right, I think as Jews, it's not our job to promote Jewish interests to the detriment of the country. Our job is to promote the country, and that's good for the Jews, right? Sometimes it might even be perceived as being counter to Jewish interest. But if we could advance a Jewish cause, but it would weaken America, would we want to promote that just because we were in power? Some would say yes. I would think not. I think that's what the real issue is. In other words, as Yirmiyah said, right, dear Shlomo, right, seek the welfare of the city that you're in.
That was the perception of the religious funding issue in Ontario. It wasn't what it was, but that was the perception of it.
There was a Jewish
Ontario ran, yeah. That it was in the interest of Jewish schools.
Yeah, I think that was the perception, but I think that it's important to understand that the current policy is unprincipled.
Absolutely.
It's historical, because it's rooted in the great compromise in the Protestants and the Catholics, but it's not founded on any principle of equity that is fair. So I think that the movement for funding for religious schools really is something which is good for the government. It shouldn't be that even the UN criticizes Canada, for its inequity in this area. Right? Yeah, but I think you're right. That is the perception.
The government managed to turn it into something else in order to stay in power.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so everyone, this is a little bit of a taste. I hope everyone have a happy Purim, happy Shushan Purim. From next week, we will go on with the